Archie Goodwin here. Welcome back to Riddle Stop. Now, I could tell you today's story is about a stolen guidance prototype and a dead chief engineer. But that's like calling a 5-alarm gala a nice party. 18 months of work gone in under 4 minutes, 6 bolts pulled clean, not a scratch on the bracket to say who'd done it. A PlayBoy industrialist who walked into our office with reporters already camped on the stoop, wanting the truth found in public, not buried quietly to protect a contract. A chief engineer whose own private ledger outlived him by 3 days and said more than he ever got the chance to say himself. A jilted actress who admitted to saying ugly things about the dead man and swore that's all she ever did. A younger brother who'd spent 9 years signing supply requisitions while his brother's face ended up on magazine covers. A Pentagon colonel with debts at the card tables that nobody wanted anywhere near a national security contract. A rival across town who wanted those blueprints badly enough to say so to my face without blinking. A countess who collects interesting men the way Mr. Wolfe collects orchids, and found the whole business rather restful by comparison. Inspector Kramer, for the record, spent the whole week convinced the obvious suspect was exactly the one man in the building who couldn't have done it. And then there's the detail nobody counted on, a spring wound 9 years too tight in one man's own family that finally gave on the one night it couldn't afford to. So settle in. This one's called Nero Wolfe, and the PlayBoy Genius. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Genius in Handcuffs. It was a Wednesday, which matters only because if it had been a Tuesday or a Thursday, I'd have had grounds to send the man back down the stoop without a word, on general principle, and let the whole business wait a day. As it was, I opened the door myself, since Fritz was up to his elbows in a marinade in the kitchen, and the bell had rung twice in the particular impatient rhythm of a man used to doors opening for him before he's finished knocking on them. Caesar got there first, the way he always does, coming down the hall from wherever he'd been dozing with that unhurried economy of motion that somehow still arrives ahead of everyone, and planted himself at the top of the vestibule steps with his ears up and his weight forward. Not menacing exactly, just letting the visitor know, in the specific grammar dogs use for such things, that further progress into the house would require his personal approval first. Apollo was already at the front window, up on his hind legs with his nose pressed to the glass, because there was a small crowd of men gathered on the sidewalk with notepads, and one fellow with a box camera slung around his neck. And Apollo does not care for crowds he hasn't been formally introduced to. Diana had drifted in from the back of the house without my having heard her, the way she does, and stood a little apart, very still, reading the visitor the way she reads everyone, for the specific frequency of nerves underneath whatever face a person chooses to show the world. "Mr. Goodwin?" the man on the stoop said, and even through the glass of the storm door, I could see he already knew the answer, the way certain men know most things about a room before they've properly entered it. "August Thorne. I'd like to see Nero Wolfe." I'd read enough about August Thorne in the papers over the years to fill a fair-sized scrapbook, and most of it hadn't prepared me for the man himself. There'd been photographs of him testing his own aircraft over Long Island Sound, with a grin that made photographers love him and insurance underwriters despair. There'd been a spread in one of the picture weeklies about the gyroscope company he'd bought for a song when he came home from the war and turned, inside of 9 years, into the outfit the Pentagon called first, whenever they wanted something guided to hit precisely where it was pointed. There'd been the usual gossip column procession of actresses and heiresses, and one memorable incident involving a yacht and a senator's daughter that the papers had never quite been able to prove, and never quite stopped implying. He was better looking in person than any of it had suggested, which is unusual and mildly irritating in a man you already suspect you're not going to like. And he had about him the specific controlled exhaustion of somebody who has been awake for rather longer than the length of one ordinary night and is determined not to let it show. "He's not seeing anyone before 11, I said, since it was true, and since it cost nothing to make a man wait a little, especially one who's used to not having to. Orchids." I read that about him too. Thorne almost smiled, and there was something genuine underneath the automatic charm of it, which surprised me more than the charm itself did. "I'll wait. I've gotten fairly good at waiting this week." I put him in the front room, which is where I put people I haven't decided about yet, and went back to check with Fritz that the coffee situation could stretch to accommodate a guest who looked like he hadn't eaten properly in 3 days. And found Diana had already stationed herself outside the front room door, head cocked at that particular angle she reserves for people she's still working over. She didn't growl. She also didn't come away and settle somewhere more comfortable. And with Diana, that absence of relaxation is worth more than most people's sworn testimony. At 11:02, right on schedule, the sound of Wolfe's private elevator groaning its way down from the plant rooms came through the ceiling, and a minute after that, he came into the office moving the way he always moves, like a battleship easing carefully into a berth. It's used many times before, and lowered himself into the chair built specifically to hold his 1/7 of a ton, with the particular small sigh of a man who resents, on principle, that even the finest furniture in the world still has limits. "There's a client in the front room," I said, "or a suspect, depending which afternoon edition you believe. The newspapers can't seem to agree, and I don't imagine he's entirely settled the question for himself either." "Thorne," Wolfe said, before I'd offered the name, which told me he'd already seen the small crowd gathered on the sidewalk, through his own window, on the ride down, and drawn the obvious conclusion from it. The way he draws obvious conclusions from most things before the rest of us have finished noticing. There was a question. The aviation man. The one the tabloids currently favor for stuffing his own chief engineer down a stairwell and mailing the country's best guided missile brain somewhere east of Berlin. Yes, that fellow. Wolfe's mouth flattened at the corners, which is as close as he generally comes in public to wincing. "Bring him in." Thorne came into the office, the way I imagined he entered most rooms he'd ever walked into. Quickly, already taking inventory of the space before he'd finished crossing the threshold. Talking before he'd properly finished sitting down in the red leather chair reserved for clients. "Mr. Wolfe, I know what the papers say about me, and I have a fairly good notion of what a man like you thinks of men who get their names into gossip columns as often as I have, and I don't have the patience this morning to argue you out of either opinion. I need you to find out who killed Desmond Rourke." "The police," Wolfe observed, folding his hands over the swell of his stomach in the posture that means he intends to listen rather than argue just yet, "are, I understand, already energetically engaged in that particular endeavor. The police like me for it." Thorne's jaw worked once, tightly, and for the first time since he'd come through the door, the restless energy in him went still, just for a second. Desmond was the best friend I had left in the world. We built that company together in a rented garage out in Farmingdale, with 4 employees, 2 war surplus lathes, and nothing but each other's word that it would ever amount to something. 3 nights ago, somebody put him in a stairwell with his neck broken and walked out of my own building with 18 months of both our lives tucked under a coat. And the Daily Mirror has already decided I did it myself to collect on the insurance. Loyal had come in behind him at some point, without my noticing the exact moment. Nobody ever quite notices the exact moment. Loyal arrives anywhere. He simply is present and settled at my side of the desk, with his chin resting on his paws, brick-red coat catching the light from the window, watching Thorne with the specific patient stillness he keeps in reserve for people he hasn't yet sorted into a category. "You have, I take it," Wolfe said, "an alibi for the hour in question." "I have 300 witnesses who watched me give a toast to the engineering staff at 9:40, and not a single one who can swear to where I was at 10:15, because I spent that particular quarter hour being sick from too much champagne in the men's lounge, alone, like an idiot who ought to have known better at 38. He said it flatly, without the flinch most men bring to admitting drunkenness before they'll admit to worse things, and I filed that away as worth noting. Most liars protect their vanity before they protect their necks. Thorne, apparently, didn't much care about the former. "And what?" Wolfe said. "Do you imagine I might accomplish in this matter that the properly constituted authorities cannot?" Thorne looked at him then, actually looked, the restless motion in him finally stilling all the way, and said, "I read about the Nadel business, the taxidermist's daughter. Everyone else involved wanted a simple, comfortable answer, and you found the true one instead, even though it turned out to be considerably more complicated and considerably less convenient for a number of important people." "I don't want convenient, Mr. Wolfe. I've had convenient handed to me all week by men who'd rather this whole business go away quietly than embarrass a defense contract. I want the truth, whoever it turns out to implicate, myself included if it comes to that." "You were a flyer during the war, I understand," Wolfe said, in the mild, apparently idle tone he uses when a question is anything but idle. "P-38s, out of England, then later out of a strip in Italy that never had a proper name I ever learned." Thorne said it without embellishment, which struck me, given his reputation for turning every anecdote into a small performance. Desmond flew transports out of the same general theatre. We met after the war, not during it. A mutual friend introduced us at a trade exhibition in '46, both of us trying to sell instruments nobody yet believed they needed. He understood gyroscopes better than any man I've ever known, before or since. I understood how to get men with money to believe in things they couldn't see the use of yet. Between the two of us, we built something neither one of us could have built alone. And in 9 years, Wolfe observed, this arrangement produced no friction worth mentioning, no disagreement over credit, over direction, over the disposition of profits. Every partnership produces friction, Mr. Wolfe. Ours produced less than most, because Desmond never wanted what I had, and I never wanted what he had. He wanted quiet and a bench to work at. I wanted noise and a reason to keep flying, even if it was only a corporate airplane now, instead of a fighter. We fit, the way two men rarely do. For the first time since he'd sat down, something genuine and unguarded moved across his face. I keep waiting to feel angry at whoever did this. Mostly I just feel like somebody removed a wall I'd been leaning on for a decade, without checking first whether I'd fall over. Wolfe let that sit a moment before he spoke again. Your brother, he said, does he share your talent for instruments, or your talent for noise? The question seemed to catch Thorne slightly off guard, coming as it did from nowhere in particular. Simon's the serious one, always has been. Engineering degree, quiet, meticulous, everything Desmond was, honestly, except Simon never got the chance to prove it the way Desmond did. I put him in supply contracts years ago, because the board wanted a family name somewhere sensible on the letterhead, and I've always meant to move him somewhere better suited to what he actually studied. I never got around to it. There was always some airplane to test, some contract to close. A shadow crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. I should have gotten around to it. Wolfe regarded him for a long moment with the particular unblinking attention he usually reserves for an orchid that has bloomed some unexpected shade he hadn't predicted from the cross. I'll consider the matter, he said finally, which from Wolfe, delivered in that tone, is not a small concession at all. Archie will take down the particulars in full. Good day, Mr. Thorne. Thorne stood, hesitated as though he wanted to say something further and thought better of it, and let me walk him out through the hall, past Caesar's parting once over, and Apollo still glued to the window watching the reporters the way a man watches weather rolling in off the water. At the door he turned back once. Your dogs, he said. The pit bull didn't take his eyes off me the whole time. Is that a good sign or a bad one? Depends what he decides, I said. Loyal doesn't hand out his verdicts early. You'll know if he changes his mind about you before you do. Thorne almost laughed, and went down the stoop past the reporters without answering a single shouted question, which I noted was either good instinct or good training, and with a man like Thorne it was starting to look like both. Chapter 2. A fee too large to refuse. By the time I'd seen Thorne down the stoop and back into a taxi past the small scrum of reporters who shouted 3 questions at once and got nothing but a tight smile for their trouble, Wolfe had already picked his current book back up off the desk, which is his particular way of pretending a decision doesn't need making just yet. You're not taking it, I said, coming back into the office and settling onto the edge of my own desk, because the whole business smells like something that belongs to the FBI, and you don't much care for the notion of being upstaged by men who all wear the same hat. I have said nothing of the kind, Wolfe said, without looking up. You didn't have to. I've watched you not take cases before. This is the face. He set the book down, deliberately, with rather more force than the act of setting down a book generally requires. A stolen instrument of war and a murdered engineer, he said, constitute on their face a matter of federal interest. Federal interest, in my experience, arrives accompanied by federal obstruction in roughly the proportion that rain accompanies clouds. So you're saying no? What? I am saying the obstruction will occur, Wolfe said, with the particular patience of a man explaining something he considers obvious, regardless of whether I am the one investigating or whether it is left entirely to men whose primary concern is protecting a Pentagon contract from embarrassment. At least were I involved, the obstruction would be occurring in the direction of the truth, rather than in the direction of whatever answer proves least awkward for everyone with a rank or a title. So you'll take it. I have not said that either. He was quiet a moment, and I recognized in his stillness the particular arithmetic of a man doing sums he'd rather not admit, even to himself, that he was doing. "What fee did Mr. Thorne propose before you distracted me with theories about my facial expressions?" I told him. Wolfe's eyebrows, which do not move readily for much of anything short of an insult to Fritz's cooking or a threat to the Orchids, moved. He said, I added, watching the number settle in, and I am quoting him fairly closely, that he doesn't want the matter solved quietly. He wants it solved correctly, in full public view, so that nobody with an interest in a smooth defense contract can quietly bury an inconvenient answer. That's an unusual request, coming from the one man currently under public suspicion. It is, Wolfe agreed, turning the thought over visibly, either the request of an innocent man entirely confident that the truth, whatever its shape, will ultimately clear him, or the request of a very clever guilty man who has calculated correctly that a loud and public exoneration will prove considerably safer for him in the long run than a quiet and private one that leaves suspicion lingering forever in the corners of people's minds. He drummed one finger against the arm of his chair, which in Wolfe passes for outright fidgeting. Telephone him back. I'll accept the engagement, on my own terms, which you will convey precisely, full and unrestricted access to the laboratory and the premises, full cooperation from every member of his staff without exception, and the clear understanding, stated plainly to his face, that should the evidence eventually point toward him, I will say so publicly, with precisely the same appetite I would bring to declaring anyone else's guilt. He'll like that last part, I said, already reaching for the telephone. Struck me as a man with a particular allergy to being handled gently. Then we shall get along tolerably well, Wolfe said, and reached over to ring the desk bell for Fritz to bring the beer, which in the private grammar of that household has always meant, more reliably than any spoken sentence, that the matter under discussion had finally been settled. Fritz brought 2 bottles instead of 1, which meant he'd been listening at the kitchen door the way he sometimes does, and had already decided, on his own authority, that a case worth that particular fee was a case worth a small private celebration. Chapter 3. Blueprints and Ashes. Thorne Aeronautics occupied 4 floors of an unremarkable-looking building on the east side, the kind of building deliberately designed, I gathered from the plain brick face and the absence of any sign larger than the company's name in modest brass letters, to look as though it manufactured nothing more dangerous than adding machines or typewriter ribbon. The vault lab itself sat on the 3rd floor, behind a steel door fitted with a combination dial, and beyond that, a secondary lock requiring 2 separate keys, turned simultaneously by 2 different people, a precaution, the day guard told me, while I waited for my credentials to be checked against a list that Desmond Rourke himself had insisted on installing 2 years back, over what I gathered had been some mild grumbling from the front office about the expense. Which means, I said to the guard, a broad, unhurried man named Petrosky, who had clearly fielded the same set of questions from half a dozen other investigators already that week, and had settled into a patient, well-worn recitation of the facts. Whoever got through that door the night of the gala either had both keys, or had Mr. Rourke's own cooperation, or had some very persuasive reason for Mr. Rourke to open it himself. Rourke opened it, Petrosky said, tapping a thick, cloth-bound logbook on the desk in front of him. I logged him in myself at 9:51 that night. Gala was still going full tilt upstairs. You could hear the band faintly, if you can believe it, right through 6 inches of poured concrete. He didn't log anybody in alongside him in the book, but the second lock don't always register a companion clean, not if somebody comes in quick and close behind, before the doors had time to swing all the way to. And Mr. Thorne's own badge, the night of the gala, didn't log through that particular door at all, not that whole evening. I've checked it twice myself, on account of half of Manhattan asking me the same question this week. Petrosky said it without any particular emphasis, the way an honest man states a fact he has no stake in either direction, and I believed him. The stairwell where Rourke's body had been found was 3 floors below the vault lab, an unglamorous concrete drum of a space that smelled faintly of machine oil, and more faintly still, of stale cigarette smoke left over from some caterer's crew. 3 nights passed. A single narrow window near the second landing looked out over a service alley running behind the building. I stood there a good while, doing nothing in particular but looking. The way Wolfe is forever instructing me to do, and the way I generally forget to do until I'm actually standing in the spot that requires it. And worked out, by pacing the distance myself with my watch in hand, that a man moving with real purpose and a genuine familiarity with the building's layout could cover the ground between the vault lab and that stairwell landing in under 90 seconds. The gala's guest list ran to 140 names, which Wolfe's terms of engagement had entitled me to examine in full, and I spent the better part of that first afternoon installed at Thorne's own desk. He'd vacated the office for my use without being asked, waving off my protest with a distracted gesture, which struck me at the time as either genuinely good manners or a rather practiced piece of theatre, though I couldn't yet say which, cross-referencing the guest list against the company's personnel files, its board of directors, where I could get at them, its most recent financial disclosures.
The names rose to the surface the way cream rises in a milk bottle, left standing overnight, not because any single piece of paper pointed a finger directly at them, but because each one, examined carefully enough, carried both a plausible reason to want either Desmond Rourke or the Falcon Eye prototype removed from the picture and some plausible route by which they might have accomplished it.
There was Vivian Castellan, whose engagement calendar with August Thorne had thinned considerably over the past several months, in almost exact proportion to how much time Thorne had been spending late at the lab with Rourke instead. There was Simon Thorne, August's younger brother by 6 years, listed in the company's own organizational chart as a supply contracts manager, despite an engineering degree the personnel file noted almost as an afterthought. There was Colonel Reeves Ashdown, the Pentagon's own procurement liaison for the Falcon Eye program, whose personal financial disclosures, obtained through channels I won't specify even now, showed a pattern of debts that didn't square comfortably with a colonel's salary. There was Bertram Halloway, who ran a competing instrumentation firm 2 blocks east, and had, according to 3 separate industry contacts I telephoned that same afternoon, made no secret whatsoever of wanting the Falcon Eye's specifications badly enough to have made at least one open approach to Rourke himself, an approach Rourke had apparently rebuffed with some public embarrassment to Halloway. And there was a Countess Ilsa Varga, whose presence on the gala's guest list nobody at Thorne Aeronautics could quite explain beyond a vague sense that she was simply always present at events of a certain size, in the company of one man or another, and whose accent and title had already, I gathered, made her the subject of at least one earlier and entirely inconclusive inquiry by government men more discreet than Kramer's detectives. Before I left the building, I stopped by Rourke's own secretary, a precise grey-haired woman named Miss Aldous, who had worked for him since the Farmingdale days, and who cried, briefly and without embarrassment, when I asked her the first question. She composed herself quickly enough afterward, and answered everything I put to her with the same exacting care I imagine she'd once brought to his correspondence. He'd been odd for a few months, she told me, locking his own desk drawer at night, which he'd never bothered doing before, asking me to pull old expense reports and supplier invoices going back years, always after the rest of the floor had gone home. I asked him once what he was chasing, and he told me it was nothing worth my worrying over, which from Mr. Rourke meant it was worth worrying over a great deal. Did he ever mention a name? Anyone he suspected? No names, but he asked me once, very carefully, whether the company's own supply contracts were handled entirely out of Mr. Simon Thorne's office, or whether other people had access to sign off on them too. I didn't think much of it at the time. I've thought of little else since. I found the gala's caterer, a harried, sharp-eyed man named Delacroix, who ran a firm specializing in exactly the sort of affair Thorne Aeronautics had thrown, setting up for a considerably smaller lunch downtown, and pulled him aside long enough to ask about the kitchen staff's movements that night. Your police already asked me all this, Delacroix said, not unkindly, wiping his hands on his apron. I'll tell you the same as I told them. My people were in and out of that service stairwell all night, running trays up from the second-floor kitchen, which is the only reason anybody thought to look there for him at all. One of my boys nearly fell over the body, bringing up a tray of oysters. Far as who else used that stairwell that night, I couldn't tell you. It's not a locked door. Anybody with legitimate business in that building could have used it without anybody thinking twice. Anybody in particular you noticed? Somebody who didn't belong? Delacroix considered this, with more care than I'd expected. There was a fellow, younger, well-dressed, came down that stairwell around 10, maybe 10:15, moving fast, like a man late for something. Didn't think anything of it. Half the guests that night were younger men in good suits moving fast, it being that kind of party. Couldn't swear to a face. It wasn't much, but 10:15 sat exactly where I needed it to sit, and I wrote it on the card beside Simon Thorne's name, with a small private satisfaction I kept entirely off my face. I wrote the 5 names on a card, the way I always do, in the order I'd found them, because Wolfe likes his suspects delivered the way Fritz delivers a properly composed menu, in sequence, with nothing missing and nothing garnished, that didn't belong there, and came back to the brownstone, a little past 7, with the card, 5 hours of notes, and no answer at all, which is precisely the condition in which Wolfe generally prefers a report to arrive, since it leaves him something worthwhile to do with the evening. Chapter 4. The Gallery of Motives. Vivian Castellan received me the following afternoon at 4 o'clock, still in a dressing gown despite the hour, in an apartment 2 blocks north of the theatre where she'd once, briefly and by all accounts memorably, had her name printed below the title on the marquee. She was handsome in the specific brittle way of a woman who has spent years learning to arrange her own face for maximum effect under stage lighting, and hasn't entirely managed to unlearn the habit under ordinary daylight, and she didn't bother pretending she was surprised to see me, or ignorant of why I'd come. "August and I have an understanding," she said, lighting a cigarette with a hand that wasn't entirely steady, though whether from nerves or simply the hour, I couldn't say. Or we did, until fairly recently. Lately his understanding seemed to run rather more toward that laboratory of his than toward me. Desmond Rourke had him 7 nights out of 7 toward the end of it. I won't pretend to you, Mr. Goodwin, that I mourned the man especially deeply for that particular inconvenience. Enough to want him gone. Enough to say some genuinely ugly things about him at a party in front of people who repeated them, certainly. Her mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. That's a rather different sport from putting a man down a stairwell, though. Wouldn't you agree? I've never in my life had to lift anything heavier than a hat box. Simon Thorne, August's younger brother, met me an hour later in a small, cramped office, 1 floor below his brother's considerably grander one, a room with the particular airless quality of a space its occupant has never quite felt entitled to decorate properly. He had the family jaw, the same set to the shoulders that I'd noticed in August, and none whatsoever of his brother's easy charm. August built this company, Simon said, with the careful, worn deliberateness of a man who had rehearsed the sentence in his own head many times before and hated it a little more with each repetition. And I've spent 9 years being the brother who signs the supply requisitions and reconciles the freight invoices, while August gets his photograph taken standing next to airplanes he didn't personally design a single instrument for. I hold an engineering degree. He never finished getting himself, Mr. Goodwin. I could have run that laboratory better than Desmond Rourke ever managed to. Draw whatever conclusion from that you find convenient. I drew several conclusions on the spot, and kept every one of them entirely to myself, which is a discipline Wolfe has spent years training into me with mixed success. "Where were you?" I asked him, as though it were an afterthought rather than the entire point of the visit, during the gala itself. 10 o'clock thereabouts? On the mezzanine most of the evening, seeing to the caterer's invoices, which nobody else in this company thinks to check, even when 140 guests are eating their way through a year's supply budget in one night. He said it quickly, a shade too quickly for a man who claimed the question hadn't caught him off guard. "You can ask the catering manager. He'll remember me hovering over him." "I intend to," I said, and watched something flicker behind his eyes that might have been irritation at being checked on, or might have been something considerably less comfortable. He didn't offer anything further, and I didn't press it there, since a man who's decided to stop talking rarely starts again just because you stand in his doorway a moment longer. Colonel Reeves Ashdown agreed to see me at his club that evening, over a whiskey he clearly needed rather more than he wished anyone present to notice. He had the tired, carefully over-controlled bearing of a man managing more than one variety of debt simultaneously, and doing a middling job of it. "I'll tell you precisely what I already told your Inspector Kramer," Ashdown said, turning his glass slowly by its base without drinking from it. "I had every professional reason under heaven to want the Falcon program to succeed on schedule, and not one single reason to want it stolen out from under me a month before delivery. My entire career sits on that program's timely completion." "And your markers at the tables on 52nd Street, Colonel?" I asked, since Saul had already run that particular thread down for me before I'd left the brownstone that morning, and there's no sense letting a good piece of legwork go to waste out of politeness. Ashdown's face didn't change a great deal, which told me rather more than an outburst would have. A man's private difficulties, he said, setting the glass down with exaggerated care, aren't evidence of anything whatsoever, Mr. Goodwin, and I'd be obliged if you'd remember that before you go repeating idle gossip to your employer. Bertram Halloway, when I called on him the next morning, didn't trouble himself with even the pretense of cooperation. Of course I wanted the Falcon Eyes specifications, he told me flatly, from behind a desk large enough to have served as a rowboat. Every serious man in my line of business wanted them, Mr. Goodwin, and any competitor of mine who claims otherwise to your face is lying to you outright. Wanting a thing badly enough to build a rival product of your own is not remotely the same as wanting it badly enough to commit murder for it. Whatever colourful theory your employer's imagination has managed to construct. Countess Ilse Varga was of all five the only one who seemed genuinely to enjoy the interview. She received me in a suite at the Carlisle with the unhurried, faintly weary amusement of a woman who had been questioned, over the course of a long and evidently interesting life, by considerably more serious men than a mere private detective's assistant, and found the whole ritual rather restful by comparison. "You want to know whether I am a spy?" she said, before I'd managed to ask a single question, settling herself into a chair by the window with the deliberate grace of a woman who has spent decades being watched, and has never once minded it. Everyone always wants to know that the moment they hear my accent and my title arrive together in the same sentence. "I collect interesting men, Mr. Goodwin. The way I understand your Mr. Wolfe collects orchids. It is a harmless vice and considerably cheaper to maintain, whatever the newspapers would prefer to believe." I came back to the brownstone late that second evening with 5 completed index cards, a headache behind my left eye, and no answer whatsoever, which, as I'd learned to expect by then, was precisely the condition in which Wolfe generally preferred a report to arrive, since it left him a genuine problem to chew on, rather than a solved one to merely approve. Chapter 5. The Second Warning. I hadn't finished my second cup of coffee the next morning before the telephone rang, with news that somebody had gone through Desmond Rourke's apartment, sometime in the small hours of the night. Not robbed exactly, since the silver and a rather good watch had both been left untouched on the dresser, but searched thoroughly, and without much regard for tidiness, filing cabinet and all, drawers left hanging open at odd angles. "They were after his private papers," I said, once I'd hung up the receiver and relayed the substance of the call to Wolfe, who was at his desk with the morning's orchid germination charts spread out in front of him, like a general reviewing troop positions, which means whoever it was already knew, or at the very least strongly suspected that Rourke kept notes on something worth the risk of a second-story job to keep quiet. Wolfe grunted, which is his particular register of agreement, and had barely returned his attention to the charts when the second call of the morning came through, this one directly to the house line itself, a man's voice flattened and distorted by something held over the mouthpiece, informing whoever answered that certain parties would do well to mind their own affairs before their affairs came looking to mind them back, with considerably less patience. I hung up the receiver slowly and went to the front window out of old habit, and found Caesar already there ahead of me, hackles very faintly raised along his spine, looking down at the street below with the particular fixed attention he reserves for things he can't quite place a category around. There was a dark sedan parked across the street that I hadn't noticed idling there the day before, its engine running low. It pulled smoothly away from the curb before I could get a decent look at the license plate, turning the corner without any particular haste, which somehow unsettled me more than if it had sped off. Fritz, when I mentioned the matter over breakfast, tightened the security chain on the front door himself without being asked, which in Fritz's private vocabulary amounts to sounding a full air raid siren. Inspector Kramer arrived a little before 11, entirely unannounced, filling the office doorway with his hat still firmly on his head, which is Kramer's own particular way of declaring hostilities before he's said a single word. "I want to know," Kramer said, dropping his considerable bulk into the red leather chair without waiting to be asked, "why a case with federal fingerprints smeared all over it has got your errand boy here crawling through 140 names on a gala guest list that are none of his damn business." "Mr. Thorne retained my services," Wolfe said, with the particular mildness he reserves for statements he knows will provoke, as is entirely his privilege as a citizen with means. "Mr. Thorne," Kramer said, jabbing a thick finger toward the window, and by extension, the world beyond it, is about one more headline away from a grand jury, and you taking his money doesn't do a blessed thing for how any of this looks to the men upstairs, who'd sooner this whole business went away quietly. I am not, Mr. Kramer, in the business of how matters look, Wolfe said, folding his hands over his stomach in the settling posture that means he intends to enjoy the coming exchange, rather than end it quickly. I am in the somewhat narrower business of how matters actually are. Since you've troubled yourself to come all this way, you might tell me what your own men found in Mr. Rourke's apartment before last night's rather less careful visitor rendered the question academic. Kramer's broad face worked through several possible responses at once, caught between the older habit of refusing Wolfe anything on principle and the still older habit of trading information when the trade genuinely favored him. Ledgers, he said finally, grudgingly. Rourke's own private bookkeeping, not company records. Payments, dates, nothing labeled plainly enough to make sense of at a glance. We've got a man from the department going through the arithmetic of it now. I would be obliged, Wolfe said, to see a full copy at the earliest convenient moment. You'll be obliged to wait your turn, same as anybody else in this city, Kramer said. But there wasn't a great deal of heat left in it by then, and when he finally levered himself back up out of the chair some 10 minutes later, Caesar escorting him with unusual formality all the way to the front door, I noticed that Kramer had left his hat sitting on the front hall table without appearing to notice the oversight at all, which told me some part of him fully intended to be back inside that office again before the day was finished. That evening, over one of Fritz's better efforts, a veal dish with a mushroom sauce that would have made the anonymous caller's threats feel entirely beside the point. Had I let it, Wolfe worked through the day's developments the way he always does at the table, which is to say obliquely, as though the case were a distant relation neither of us much wanted to discuss directly over a meal this good. The search of Rourke's apartment troubles you, I said, when the silence had stretched long enough that I judged it safe to break. It troubles me for a specific reason, Wolfe said, setting down his fork with the particular precision he brings to interrupting a meal, only when a thought genuinely demands it. A thief searching for a stolen prototype's whereabouts would have no interest whatsoever in a dead man's filing cabinet. A thief searching to determine how much a dead man had already discovered and documented about an entirely separate and ongoing arrangement would have every interest in exactly that filing cabinet and precious little time in which to satisfy it before the police thought to search it themselves. Which means whoever searched it already knew about the ledger before Kramer's men ever found it. Which means, Wolfe said, whoever searched it was considerably more worried about what Mr. Rourke had written down over the preceding months than about what had already been stolen from the vault lab itself. Those are not, Archie, necessarily the same anxiety, and I begin to suspect they very much are not the same person's anxiety either, in the sense you presently assume. You think there's someone besides our 5 names in this? I think, Wolfe said, returning his attention to the veal with the air of a man who has said quite enough for one evening, that we have not yet earned the right to think anything with confidence, and that a second bottle of the Montrachet would improve the odds considerably that we eventually will. I didn't argue with that particular piece of logic, and neither, I noticed, did Fritz, who brought the second bottle before either of us had finished asking. Chapter 6. The Guidance Problem. Saul Panzer came by a little after 4 that afternoon with the particular quiet, unhurried satisfaction of a man who has found precisely what he went looking for and knows better than to rush the telling of it. He laid 3 photographs of the Vault Lab's damaged housing panel across Wolfe's desk, photographs I'd taken myself the day before, at Wolfe's specific instruction of the exact spot where the Falcon Eye's outer casing had been carefully unbolted from its mounting bracket. Showed these to a fellow I know, Saul said, settling into the chair he preferred, the one nearest the door. Retired instrument man, spent 30 years with Sperry before the war caught up with him. He looked these over twice, real careful, and told me whoever took that housing off did it clean as you like. No scratches on the bracket, no forced bolts, no damage anywhere at all to the mounting itself. 4 minutes, maybe 5 at the outside, he figures, if the fellow doing it knew exactly which 6 bolts to loosen and in precisely what order to loosen them. Which, Wolfe said, studying the photographs through his reading glasses with evident interest, eliminates rather more of our gallery of suspects than it manages to implicate. Holloway's a businessman clean through. Not an engineer, I said. working the logic of it out loud as I went. Ashdown wouldn't know one end of a wrench from the other if his career depended on it, which in a sense it does. The Countess collects men for company, not machinery for its own sake. That leaves us, by my count, Miss Castellan, whose evident talents lie considerably elsewhere, Wolfe said, and Mr. Simon Thorne, who informed you himself, with what I suspect was rather more candor than caution on his part, that he holds an engineering degree his own brother never quite got around to finishing. He also had motive standing in line waiting to be noticed. I said, 9 years passed over, running supply contracts while August gets the magazine covers and the pretty girls on his arm. Motive, Wolfe said, setting the photographs down with a small dismissive gesture, is cheap, Archie, and always has been. Every soul in that gallery of yours carries some flavor of it. What is genuinely expensive, and therefore worth our attention, is opportunity married to a very specific and rather narrow variety of competence. He was quiet a long moment, turning one photograph slightly under the desk lamp to catch the light differently. Get me Mr. Kramer's promised copy of that ledger, by whatever means happen to be available to you tonight, and find out, with some precision, what precisely Desmond Rourke's own private notes were tracking, before some interested party decided the tracking of it was worth killing him to keep permanently quiet. Saul, who has never in the whole of his professional career required being told a thing twice, was already reaching for his hat before Wolfe had finished the sentence. While we waited on Saul, Wolfe had me telephone Thorne Aeronautics and request, in the driest possible language, a complete inventory of every employee who had ever received formal instruction in the Vault Lab's own maintenance procedures, on the theory which he explained to me with visible reluctance, since explaining himself mid-investigation has never been among his favorite pastimes, that a man capable of removing 6 bolts cleanly in the dark had very likely been trained to do so at some point, by somebody, and that training tends to leave a paper trail, even when the training itself is never mentioned again afterward. The inventory came back the following morning, 3 names long, and Simon Thorne's was on it, dated 4 years back, a single afternoon's instruction logged by Desmond Rourke himself, in his own tidy hand. The kind of small, forgotten courtesy an older engineer extends to a younger man, he assumes, wrongly as it turned out, has no further use for the knowledge beyond idle curiosity. Chapter 7. 6 chairs and a confession trap. It took Saul the better part of 2 full days, and I strongly suspect the better part of a $20 bill pressed discreetly into the palm of a records clerk who will remain forever nameless in these pages. But the copy of Rourke's private ledger finally arrived at the brownstone the following evening, and Wolfe spent the better part of an hour and a half bent over it with the reading glasses. He insists against all visible evidence that he doesn't strictly require. He was tracking payments, Wolfe said finally, sliding several of the pages across the desk toward me. Not payments made to Rourke himself, you understand, but payments moving from an account he apparently didn't control into an account he was patiently attempting to trace, going back very nearly 4 years. Small sums at the outset, considerably larger of late, the whole pattern accelerating sharply over the past 6 months. He'd annotated 3 separate entries, near the more recent end of the ledger, with a single set of initials, ST. Simon Thorne, I said, though it hardly needed saying at that point. So it would certainly appear, Wolfe agreed, though initials scrawled in a dead man's private ledger are worth precisely as much as any confession extracted under duress, which is to say, worth rather less than confirming properly before we place any real reliance upon them. He set the pages down with evident care, as though they might still bruise. It is time, I think, to invite the whole gallery to the office. Together, if their collective tempers will bear the strain of it, since a group interview under pressure will tell us a good deal more than 5 separate polite conversations conducted at everyone's individual leisure. They arrived the following afternoon in a loose, uncomfortable procession. August Thorne first, restless as ever, pacing the width of the office twice before he finally sat down, his brother Simon perhaps 20 minutes behind him, taking the chair nearest the door as though he might need the quickest possible exit. Then Vivian Castellan, in a hat with considerably more brim than the modest room strictly required. Then Colonel Ashdown, looking as though sleep had become a stranger to him this past week. Then Halloway, looking by irritating contrast as though he'd slept perfectly soundly through the whole affair. And finally the Countess, arriving last of all and settling into the chair nearest the door with the unhurried amusement of a woman who suspected she might need a quick exit for reasons entirely her own. Wolfe worked the room the way he always works, a room full of nervous people, circling the central questions rather than approaching them directly, doubling back on details he'd apparently already dropped, asking Holloway a pointed technical question about instrumentation that Holloway visibly couldn't answer and tellingly didn't especially need to, asking Ashdown a carefully phrased question about certain gambling debts that made the Colonel's water glass rattle audibly against the little side table, asking the Countess nothing whatsoever for the better part of 20 full minutes, a silence that unsettled her. I noticed rather more thoroughly than any direct accusation could possibly have managed. "I confess myself curious, Colonel," Wolfe said at one point, turning without warning from a line of questioning about the gala's caterers, "as to how a man of your rank came to owe rather more than a full year's salary to certain establishments on 52nd Street that do not, as a rule, extend that kind of patience to strangers." Ashdown went the color of old parchment. "That is an entirely private matter, and I fail to see—" "You fail to see it," Wolfe said, "because you would prefer not to. I am not accusing you of theft, Colonel. I am observing merely that a man drowning in debt makes an excellent target for anyone wishing to divert suspicion away from themselves and toward a more convenient scapegoat, and I would ask you to consider, over the next several minutes, who among this room might have found it useful to let such a rumor circulate." Holloway, for his part, seemed almost to relish his own turn under the lamp. "You'll get nothing incriminating out of me, Mr. Wolfe, because there's nothing to get. I told your man Goodwin the truth, the first time he asked, and I'll tell it to you now for the price of nothing. I wanted those specifications the way any man in my trade wants his rival's secrets, which is to say badly, openly, and without the faintest inclination to commit murder over it. I have lawyers for disappointment. I don't need a stairwell." Diana had drifted quietly into the room partway through the proceedings and taken up a position near Simon Thorne's chair without quite touching him, simply present at his elbow, and I noticed, because noticing precisely such things has become the whole of my professional business over the years, that Simon's hand, resting on his own knee, had gone entirely still the moment she settled there beside him, as though stillness itself might somehow render him a little less visible to the room at large. "Mr. Thorne," Wolfe said, meaning Simon this time, and letting the resulting silence stretch a beat longer than was strictly comfortable before continuing, "your degree, I am given to understand, is in mechanical engineering, and was awarded with some genuine distinction from an institution you have not. I notice troubled yourself to mention to any of the newspapers currently characterizing you merely as your brother's somewhat underused younger sibling." "I don't see what my education has to do with anybody's murder," Simon said, and his voice had gone noticeably thinner in the space of that single sentence than it had been 3 sentences earlier. "6 bolts, Wolfe said, unhurried, removed cleanly, in precisely the correct sequence, in under 4 minutes, by a hand that required no instruction whatsoever to know which 6 bolts or in what order. That is not, Mr. Thorne, the education of a supply contracts manager who spends his working days reconciling freight invoices. That is the specific education of a man who has spent rather more time inside that particular laboratory than his official job title on the company's own organizational chart would ever suggest, and I suspect rather more accumulated resentment about it than he has permitted himself to admit, even to his own brother. I might add that Mr. Rourke himself logged a single afternoon's maintenance instruction to you, 4 years past, which he had, I would guess, entirely forgotten about by the time it mattered." Simon's mouth opened, and for a long moment nothing whatsoever came out of it, and it was August Thorne himself, not Wolfe, who finally broke the silence that followed, leaning forward abruptly in the red leather chair, his face working through something complicated between plain disbelief and the first dawning edge of real grief. "Simon," he said quietly, in a voice I hadn't heard from him before, stripped entirely of its usual easy charm, "tell me it isn't true, please." Chapter 8. The Falcon Eye's Flight Path. It might have ended right there, in the office, with a confession dragged reluctantly out of Simon under the sheer weight of his own brother's stare, and for a moment I genuinely believed it would, watching his carefully maintained composure crack visibly across the whole width of his face. But he pulled it back together with the particular stubbornness of a man who has spent 9 long years perfecting the specific art of never admitting anything to anyone under any circumstances, and said, in a voice gone deliberately careful and flat, Wanting to be properly noticed in a laboratory isn't a crime, Mr. Wolfe, whatever theory you've constructed about it this afternoon. You'll have to do considerably better than a story about 6 bolts and an old family grievance if you mean to hang a murder on me in front of witnesses. Wolfe's eyes didn't so much as flicker at the challenge. I intend to do precisely that, Archie. This was my cue, arranged carefully the night before over a late supper Fritz had left warming for us, and I laid it out exactly the way we'd rehearsed it. That word had reached us, through certain channels Wolfe declined entirely to specify to the room, that a buyer connected to a certain overseas concern had recently been offered a guidance instrument, matching the general description of the Falcon Eye, through an intermediary reportedly operating out of a warehouse near the Brooklyn docks, and that the sale in question was expected to complete within the next 48 hours unless something intervened. It was, of course, entirely invented from beginning to end. Wolfe's oldest and most reliable trick, dressed up freshly for a new client, but it worked precisely the way it generally does, because a genuinely guilty man simply cannot afford to treat a plausible lie about his own crime as though it were somebody else's business entirely. The room reacted exactly the way Wolfe had wanted it to. Holloway leaned forward with naked commercial interest, already half composing. I suspected the letter of complaint he intended to file with somebody about a rival firm's specifications wandering loose in the world. Ashdown went a shade paler still, no doubt calculating what a leak of that magnitude would do to a career already balanced on markers he couldn't cover. The countess merely smiled, faintly, as though the whole performance amused her more than it alarmed her. August Thorne, however, had deliberately not been let in on the invention beforehand, because Wolfe had judged correctly as events would shortly bear out, and rather against my own strenuous private advice, that Thorne's own entirely genuine alarm would sell the trap to the room a good deal more convincingly than any actor's rehearsed performance possibly could have managed. He was on his feet before Wolfe had even finished the sentence. The docks, I know that particular warehouse. We lease storage space 2 piers down from it ourselves. I can be there myself inside 20 minutes if I take a cab. You will do nothing whatsoever of the kind, Wolfe said, with a real sharpness that cut cleanly through the room, unless you have some private wish to hand whoever is presently watching this office an obvious excuse to vanish entirely before Mr. Kramer's men can get properly into position near that pier. One is Thorne, being exactly the sort of man who solves every problem that crosses his path with his own 2 hands, rather than trusting anybody else to solve it correctly on his behalf, didn't listen at first, and it took Archie's own quick physical intervention. A firm hand on his arm, a low urgent word about how 3 careful nights of groundwork don't survive one impatient client crashing headlong into the middle of it, to keep him inside the brownstone at all, pacing the length of the office over and over again, like a man confined to a cage entirely of his own making. Kramer, summoned by a discreet telephone call the moment the room had cleared, took some persuading before he'd commit men to a stakeout built on a story Wolfe flatly refused to explain the origins of, and it was only the ledger itself, laid out plainly on the desk between them, that finally moved him. If your tame ledger's right about the initials, Kramer said, jamming his hat back on, then this whole business closes tonight, one way or another, and I'd sooner my men were standing there to see it than reading about it in tomorrow's papers, same as everybody else. By the time Kramer's men had been quietly positioned near the pier that evening, well out of sight, and Saul had confirmed, from a careful, discreet distance across the street, that a single figure had arrived at the warehouse's side door at precisely the appointed hour, carrying a case of roughly the right size and heft to hold a guidance housing. The trap had already done the whole of its real work in the one place that actually mattered, because Simon Thorne, informed by a carefully anonymous telephone call that his own brother had somehow learned about the warehouse and was headed there himself, that very evening had panicked exactly the way a genuinely guilty man panics under sudden pressure, and gone directly to retrieve the real prototype from wherever he'd been keeping it hidden these past 3 nights, intending to move it somewhere safer before daylight could catch him out. He walked instead straight into Saul Panzer and 2 of Kramer's own waiting detectives, the case still gripped tightly in his hand. Chapter 9. The Weight of the Truth. They brought Simon Thorne back to the brownstone, rather than directly to the precinct house, at Wolfe's own particular insistence, and, to my mild and continuing surprise, Kramer's rather grudging agreement, Wolfe's argument being, as he explained it to Kramer in the hallway, while Simon was still being brought up the stoop, that a man freshly caught in the act will generally talk more freely, and considerably more completely, in a room where he has already once tried and visibly failed to lie his way clear of suspicion, than he ever would inside an interrogation room, specifically built and furnished for exactly that grim purpose, and therefore resented by every suspect on principle before a single question has even been asked. The dogs settled quietly into their accustomed positions as the office slowly filled, Caesar taking up his post by the door, Mars stationed near the window with his weight forward, Apollo pacing restlessly along the length of the bookshelves, Minerva very still in the far corner nearest Wolfe's own desk, watching Simon with an attention that seemed, even to me, faintly and unmistakably like judgment, being quietly rendered. Loyal sat close by my chair as always, and August Thorne sat beside his own brother, without quite managing to look directly at him, his hands laced together so tightly across his knee that the knuckles had gone entirely pale. "You may as well have the whole of it plainly," Wolfe said, once the room had properly settled and Fritz had discreetly closed the office door behind the last arrival, "since the ledger itself will tell most of the story, regardless of what you choose to say here this evening, and the telling of it will go rather more easily for you, in whatever comes next, if it arrives from your own mouth freely rather than dragged out of you sentence by grudging sentence in some colder room downtown. Mr. Holloway did not, I think, ever offer you money for stolen secrets outright, whatever the newspapers will no doubt prefer to print tomorrow morning. He offered you money, initially, for simple access, small things at first, nothing that would ever be missed by anyone. A production schedule here, a supplier's name there. Nothing that would look, on its own, and in isolation, like genuine theft to anybody paying only casual attention. It began, I would estimate from the ledger's own pattern, very nearly 4 years ago now, around the same general period that your brother's company first began receiving the kind of public recognition you yourself had come, quite reasonably, to feel ought to have been shared rather more evenly between the two of you. Simon said nothing at all to this, which in the particular grammar of that crowded room amounted to its own thorough confirmation. Desmond Rourke discovered the pattern of it in your brother's own company books, Wolfe continued, not, I think, because he ever specifically suspected you by name, but simply because he was by nature a meticulous man who noticed small financial inconsistencies as a matter of long professional habit, the same way a careful engineer notices a machine running very slightly out of true. He began quietly tracking the payments himself, in a private ledger of his own, rather than through official channels, because he wished, I suspect, to be entirely certain of the facts before he ever brought the matter to your brother's attention directly. A kindness on his part. In its way, though it ultimately proved a fatal one for him, he confronted you the night of the gala, in the vault lab itself, where you yourself had gone, I would guess specifically to remove whatever remaining evidence of the arrangement might still exist somewhere in the company's own private records, and where the Falcon Eye prototype simply happened to be the single most valuable and portable object within immediate reach when that confrontation between the two of you went a good deal further than either man present had originally intended it to go. He was going to tell August that very night, Simon said, and his carefully maintained voice had finally lost the last of its practiced flatness. At the gala itself, in front of everyone gathered there, 9 years, Mr. Wolfe, 9 years of being the brother who signs the supply requisitions while August gets his photograph taken standing next to airplanes. He never personally touched a single instrument on, and Desmond was fully prepared to end the whole of it in front of 300 people, all because he'd found some numbers written down in a private ledger that were never really any of his business to begin with. And so you took the housing, Wolfe said, quietly now, not because you had some waiting buyer of your own lined up as the papers will no doubt speculate tomorrow, but because in the terrible moment immediately following Desmond Rourke's death, you needed the theft itself to appear as though it were the true reason he had died, rather than allow the much plainer and considerably more damning truth of the matter to come out instead. Simon didn't answer that particular observation directly. He didn't need to. August Thorne, seated beside him, made a low sound that wasn't quite a word at all, and put his face into both hands, and for the first and only time in the entire course of the business, said nothing whatsoever. Kramer, standing near the door with his notebook finally out, let the silence run its course before he spoke, and when he did, his voice had none of its usual gruffness in it. For what it's worth, Thorne, he said to August, nobody in this room enjoyed watching that. One further matter, Wolfe said, Once Simon had been formally cautioned and the worst of the raw shock in the room had settled into something quieter, for the sake of completeness, since I dislike leaving a client with unanswered corners in a case he's paid handsomely to have finished properly. The search of your apartment, Mr. Rourke's apartment, I should say, and the telephone call made to this house, those were your doing as well, I take it, once you understood the police had recovered his private ledger and that its contents, properly read, would eventually lead in your direction. Simon's silence this time carried none of the earlier defiance in it. I didn't know what he'd written down, he said finally, dully. Only that he'd been asking questions, pulling old invoices. I thought if I could find his notes before anyone else did, I could still fix it quietly, pay it back somehow, make it look like an accounting error instead of what it was. And the telephone call? I panicked. I thought if I frightened your man off the guest list before he'd finished going through it, I'd buy myself another day or two to think. He laughed. Once, a short bitter sound with nothing of his brother's charm in it at all. It didn't buy me anything. It just told you I had something worth being frightened about. Fear generally does announce itself rather more loudly than the fearful intend, Wolfe said, not unkindly. It is, I find, one of the more reliable constants in this line of work. Colonel Ashdown, who had sat through the whole of the confrontation in visible and growing relief as it became clear the ledger's initials pointed nowhere near his own debts, cleared his throat from across the room. I don't suppose, he said, with the careful dignity of a man salvaging what pride he could from an unpleasant evening, that any of this need reach the Pentagon in more detail than the bare recovery of the prototype requires. Your gambling debts, Colonel, Wolfe said, are your own affair, and none of mine, so long as they remain merely debts and nothing worse. I have no particular interest in advertising them further than tonight's necessity required. Ashdown's relief was almost comic in its thoroughness, and he excused himself from the office within the minute, moving, I noted, with rather more energy than he'd shown all week. Bertram Halloway lingered only long enough to offer August Thorne a stiff, formal word of something that might have been sympathy if delivered by a warmer man, and the Countess left last of the outer circle, pausing at the door to look back at Wolfe with an expression I couldn't entirely read. You are, I think, a more dangerous man than your reputation suggests, Mr. Wolfe, she said. I mean that as a compliment, whatever you choose to make of it. Wolfe inclined his head a fraction of an inch, which was as much acknowledgement as she was going to get, and she left with the same unhurried amusement she'd arrived with, a woman evidently satisfied that the evening, whatever else it had been, had not been dull. Chapter 10. Orchids at Dawn. Kramer took Simon Thorne out through the front hall himself a little while later, and had the unexpected decency, for once in his career, not to make any particular production of the departure in front of the assembled dogs, who watched the whole quiet procession pass with the same solemn, careful attentiveness they generally reserve for departures they don't fully understand the reasons behind. Caesar walked 3 measured paces alongside the little group all the way to the door, as though formally seeing off an ordinary departing guest rather than a man under arrest, which struck me at the time as either remarkably wise on Caesar's part or else entirely accidental, and with Caesar, honestly, it's never easy to tell for certain which. August Thorne stayed behind in the office for a while, after all the others had finally gone, standing near the window, without quite managing to find the right words for whatever was working through him. The Falcon eyes fully recovered, he said at last, his voice still hoarse. The Pentagon satisfied with the outcome. My own name's entirely clear now, exactly the way I originally asked you to make it. He laughed once, a short, humorless sound with nothing genuine behind it. I don't think I ever properly considered, when I first walked in here, what it might actually end up costing me to get that particular result. The truth, Wolfe said, not unkindly, very rarely arrives priced the way any of us would have preferred to pay for it in advance. Thorne nodded slowly at that, and something in his usual restless, kinetic energy had gone noticeably quieter than it had been 3 days earlier, in the particular way a man goes quiet after learning something genuinely difficult about his own family from a stranger's mouth, rather than from a member of that family itself. What happens to him now? He asked, though I suspect he already knew the general shape of the answer and simply needed to hear it said aloud by somebody else. That, Wolfe said, is a matter for the district attorney's office, and rather beyond the scope of what you engage me to determine. I was hired to find the truth of who killed Mr. Rourke, and what became of your prototype. Both questions are now answered. What the law chooses to make of those answers is not, properly speaking, my concern, nor, I would gently suggest, is it a matter you can do anything further to influence tonight beyond exhausting yourself trying. Thorne absorbed that with a small, tired nod, and something in his shoulders eased slightly, as though being told plainly where his own responsibility ended was, in its own strange way, a mercy. He shook Wolfe's hand, which Wolfe permitted with his usual visible reluctance toward any unnecessary physical contact, and shook mine afterward with rather more evident warmth, and left the brownstone at last without any reporters waiting on the stoop to greet him, since Saul had quietly seen to that particular detail nearly an hour beforehand. Fritz had been working on a duck in the kitchen for most of that entire afternoon, the rich smell of it drifting steadily through the whole house in a way that made my stomach remind me, rather insistently, that it was already well past any reasonable hour for lunch, though I already knew, from long and settled habit, that it would never actually make it to the dinner table that evening, on account of some private household rule older than my own time in that particular house, a rule nobody had ever fully explained to my satisfaction, and nobody in all my years there had ever seriously thought to question aloud. Wolfe rang the desk bell for beer, which meant, in the household's own reliable private grammar, that the case, so far as he personally was concerned, had now formally concluded, and picked his current book back up off the desk, and it was very nearly 20 minutes later before the elevator carried him back up to the plant rooms for his regular 4 o'clock session with the Orchids, arriving right on schedule as always, as though the entire eventful preceding week had amounted to nothing more than a mildly interesting interruption to the only calendar that had ever truly mattered to him in the first place. Loyal came and rested his head against my knee while I sat finishing up my notes for the case file, exactly the way he does at the quiet end of most cases, and I found myself sitting there thinking, not for the first time, that for all of August Thorne's evident charm and restless speed and genuine engineering brilliance, it had taken 9 long years of silence in a considerably slower and quieter man to actually kill somebody in the end, which is, I suppose, the particular kind of hard lesson you learn all over again every few cases or so, and somehow still manage to half forget again almost as quickly. The brownstone settled back into its own familiar evening rhythms, well before dinner, exactly the way it always eventually does, as though the whole loud business of the past week had never really touched it at all.